On the broadcast tonight, Second Opinion, the heated debate over health care reform gets even hotter. Where is it all headed? Air traffic control and the crowded skies over New York City. What's to prevent another collision? Pressure drop, something new in treating high blood pressure, and it's being called a breakthrough. And after the fight, keeping faith with Marines home from war, helping find work for those who served. Also tonight, it's happened again, a plane full of passengers stuck on the tarmac, but why? Nightly News begins now.
From NBC News World Headquarters in New York, this is NBC Nightly News with Brian Williams.
Good evening. Today found President Obama in Mexico, a one-day, three-nation summit during a week with a lot going on. The president himself said today he had a lot on his plate. When asked about immigration reform, for example, he said that should come later this year. But on health care, knowing that's the issue that awaits him back in Washington, he said today he thinks reasoned arguments will actually emerge, and he thinks all this noise going on at all those town hall meetings across the country is a part of that process. We begin tonight with White House correspondent Savannah Guthrie. She's in Guadalajara, Mexico. Savannah, good evening.
Good evening, Brian. This was a short summit, and the three leaders covered everything from the economy to energy to the swine flu. But it is the healthcare debate at home that followed him here to Mexico. Meeting with the leaders of Canada and Mexico, the president used a post-summit news conference after brief technical difficulties.
Testing. Good morning and buenos dias.
To urge calm in the healthcare debate raging at home.
I suspect that once we get into the fall and people look at the actual legislation that's being proposed, that more sensible and reasoned arguments will emerge, and we're going to get this passed.
But the president's call for calm.
Not wanting you folks in charge of my health care is my number one priority.
Is in contrast to an increasingly raucous scene at town halls like this one today in New Jersey. Hundreds packed the room to give Congressman Steve Rothman an earful.
You're not going to exclude illegal aliens, and the spending has
a political toll.
Understand, though, I'm not acting based on short-term political calculations. I'm looking at what's best for the country long-term. If I had been making short-term political calculations, I wouldn't be standing here as president, because nobody calculated that I could win the presidency.
Well, the president tomorrow could experience this new town hall dynamic firsthand. He'll travel to New Hampshire to talk healthcare, Brian.
Savannah Guthrie in Guadalajara, Mexico, to start us off tonight. Savannah, thanks. This was a deadly day in Iraq, the kind of day Iraqis had hoped was behind them. Series of bombings left as many as 50 people dead, including 2 early morning blasts in Baghdad and an awful explosion outside Mosul in the north. 2 flatbed trucks packed with explosives leveled a village, leaving 28 dead, almost 155 wounded, and nearly 100 Iraqis have been killed now just since Friday alone. Here in New York, on the Hudson River, search teams have now found the remains of that small private plane involved in the deadly mid-air collision with the helicopter giving a tour over the weekend. All 9 people in both aircraft were killed. Also tonight, we're hearing the first emergency calls now from onlookers who saw it all happen. NBC's Tom Costello is on the New Jersey side of the Hudson River in Hoboken tonight. Tom, good evening.
Hi, Brian. Good evening to you. The NYPD says its divers have found a body inside that plane, but they haven't been able to extricate it. They also tell us that the plane is in such difficult, shifting water that they've decided to secure it for tonight. They'll go back to it tomorrow. But the real question today is whether the airspace over my head is too complicated, unregulated, and in fact, maybe too dangerous. With the heat index pushing a sweltering 100 degrees, dive teams spent their day back on the Hudson River. By mid-afternoon, investigators said they thought they'd found what they were looking for.
It continues to be very challenging conditions. The water in this area that they're looking is very deep, some 50 to 60 feet deep.
Also today, the first 911 calls from Saturday's mid-air collision.
I just saw an airplane hit a helicopter in the Hudson River here.
Investigators are looking into whether the sight-seeing helicopter was in the small plane's blind spot beneath its wings as it made a right turn over the Hudson River, crashing into the rear of the chopper. Chopper pilot Ben Lane, who flies for the same sightseeing company, saw the plane coming and tried to warn fellow pilot Jeremy Clark.
I say to him, I say, hey, Jeremy, I say, you have an airplane. He's off to your back right side. I said, I don't know if he's going to pass off to your backside, behind you, to your left, or what.
Seconds later, impact. The question now, is the Hudson's airspace too congested? All of this airspace over the Hudson River and below 1,100 feet is unregulated and full of helicopters and planes. 25,000 sightseeing helicopter flights last year, 23,000 Wall Street helicopter flights, and very few accidents or incidents.
If you don't listen carefully and speak very quickly, this is not the place for you to fly, but if you have a lot of training and you can handle it, there's no reason to think that you're not safe.
Still, some New York lawmakers say the Hudson Corridor is inherently unsafe and are again calling for tougher air regulations.
Saturday's tragedy underscores the urgency of this issue. The Hudson River flight corridor must not continue to be the Wild West. The FAA must act immediately before further lives are lost. If it does not, Congress will act.
In the 8 days before this accident, there were on average 225 flight operations in just this 3-mile airspace, 225 each day. Back in 2006, over Manhattan, when a plane crashed, the FAA imposed new restrictions on the East River, but the Hudson River, Brian, remains largely unregulated. Back to you.
All right, Tom Costello. We'll see how this changes things, if at all. Tom Costello on the Hudson River. Another aviation story in the news tonight, but this one has to do with members of Congress, how they travel and the money they spend on themselves. Our report tonight from our senior investigative correspondent, Lisa Myers.
Remember when members of Congress pummeled auto industry CEOs for coming to Washington on private jets?
It's almost like seeing a guy show up at the soup kitchen in high hat and tuxedo.
I'm going to ask you to raise your hand if you're planning to sell your jet and fly back commercial. Let the record show no hands went up.
Well, now the House has voted to spend more money on private jets for top government officials, jets to ferry the military, administration officials, and of course, members of Congress. The House added $230 million to the Pentagon's budget for 2 Gulfstream 550s, a luxury business jet, and for 2 Boeing 737s. And it stipulated that the Gulfstreams be based at Andrews Air Force Base right outside Washington.
This is not the right time to be buying fancy jets to fly members of Congress around on.
A spokesman for the House Appropriations Committee argues that Congress uses this fleet only 4 will have to scrape by with the private jets they already have. Lisa Myers, NBC News, Washington.
You may know one of the great euphemisms in life is the term regional jet. While they are jets, they are designed for short hauls. The seats are small and they're no roomier than some prop planes. Now imagine a 13-hour odyssey involving a regional jet, including sleeping on one because of an airline meltdown like the one that happened a few days back in Minnesota. It's the latest nightmare in the flying business, and NBC's Ann Thompson has our report.
The plane says Continental, but the operator was ExpressJet. Tonight, both are trying to explain how Flight 2816 became the latest entry in the catalog of passenger horror stories.
They made no efforts to get us off the plane.
Link Kristen was one of 47 passengers on the Embraer 145 aircraft. Continental Flight 2816 left Houston at 9:23 Friday night for Minneapolis. It was supposed to arrive at 11:54, but thunderstorms forced the flight into a holding pattern. Running low on fuel, it diverted to Rochester, Minnesota at 12:28 a.m., 80 miles short of its goal, and that's when the real trouble began. The 3-person crew hit its time limit and could not fly, so another crew had to be brought in. But the passengers were not allowed to get off the plane.
I mean, there was no explanation at all. The terminal was 50 yards from where we were.
ExpressJet refused to let them deplane because the TSA screeners had gone home and there were not enough airport personnel to let the passengers sleep in the terminal. Instead, the passengers and the crew slept on the plane.
They didn't have food and they didn't have water, and there was one bathroom and there were 2 babies crying all night.
After TSA screeners arrived the next morning, passengers were finally let off the plane about 6:30. 2 hours later, they got back on and took off, landing at last in Minneapolis at 9:15 a.m. In a statement, ExpressJet apologized, saying its priorities were ensuring customer safety during extreme weather and following all federal regulations at the airport facility. Continental apologized too, promising a full ticket refund and certificate good for future travel for passengers who felt more like hostages than customers. Ann Thompson, NBC News, New York.
A misunderstanding led to a flare of temper from Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. It happened in Kinshasa, Congo, where she just passed the halfway point of her 7-nation, 11-day African trip. She thought someone asked her for her husband's opinion of an international matter.
Wait, you want me to tell you what my husband thinks? My husband is not the Secretary of State. I am. So you ask my opinion, I will tell you my opinion. I'm not going to be channeling my husband.
It was all chalked up to an error in translation, however, and afterwards the secretary and the questioner shook hands and made light of it. It turns out it was a question about President Obama's stand on an international loan, and it was the translator who had misspoken. Still ahead as our broadcast continues along the way on a Monday night, what may be a revolutionary new way to manage one of the most common and most dangerous health conditions in this country and do it without medication. And later, life after the fight for some of America's best warriors.
In his own words, Brian Williams on Hurricane Katrina.
I can't get their faces out of my mind.
A Weather Channel premiere tomorrow.
We're back now with what may be a breakthrough in helping millions of people control a common condition often called the silent killer. It's hypertension, high blood pressure. As our chief science correspondent Robert Bazell reports, an experimental device more commonly associated with heart conditions may turn out to be a new option for patients who can't control their condition with medicine.
Your blood pressure's okay?
Yeah.
Okay.
The experimental pacemaker has so far proven highly effective in controlling blood pressure without drugs. The earliest implants have been in people who have had a lot of trouble.
So they're on 3.
No. Robert Bazell, NBC News, Los Angeles.
Up next here tonight, why Great Britain is turning its back on a royal tradition that's been around for centuries.
Tomorrow, a Today exclusive. For 30 years, Alana Stewart and Farrah Fawcett were best friends. Their remarkable journey, only on NBC.
This is how bad it got in East Asia today, where typhoon season is making a mess of things across the region. Torrential rains, flooding in Taiwan caused buildings to collapse, triggered a mudslide in one mountain village that reportedly buried up to 600 people. A pair of powerful earthquakes to report tonight as well. A 6.6 quake centered about 100 miles southwest of Tokyo, shook some buildings, forced a halt to the bullet train, in fact. No casualties or serious damage reported early on. And a 7.6 quake centered 20 miles down below the Indian Ocean, north of the Andaman Islands, triggered a tsunami watch for a brief time. For much of the surrounding region, a lot of it roughly the same region you'll recall, devastated by that massive tsunami 4.5 years ago now. General Motors announced today it's boldly entering the era of eBay. The company says it hopes to soon offer its entire line of cars and trucks on the website where potential GM customers can bid on them. GM, as you may know, is undergoing a top-to-bottom rebuild. It just got out of bankruptcy. This rollout would start in California at first, and if it's successful, it would go on eBay nationwide. And good news from the UK. People visiting the Queen no longer have to walk backwards out of a room. Originally designed as a way to avoid turning one's back on the monarch, of course. It's a custom that was depicted in the film The Queen.
And when you're in the presence, at no point must you show your back.
The presence?
Yes, sir. That's what it's called when you're in Her Majesty's company.
the presence. Apparently, the practice, which has been dying out of late, has been quietly dropped by the folks who handle protocol around the Queen out of concern for the, quote, health and safety of those involved, presumably tripping over rugs. Only the most senior officials will continue the practice, so the heat is off the rest of us. When we come back here tonight, finding a way to return the favor for some Marines home from the fight. Finally tonight, the men and women in uniform who are hard at work in this nation's dual wars. The military makes them into very good fighters, but that can often be a problem when they come home and they need other skills to make it through these tough economic times. People are stepping up now so that recently returned veterans can make a living. Our report tonight from our own Maria Menounos at Camp Pendleton in California.
Skilled in combat and modern weaponry, America's most versatile warriors, the Marines, are...
And that is our broadcast for this Monday night as we start off a new week. Thank you for being with us. I'm Brian Williams, and we hope to see you right back here tomorrow evening. Good night.